Hello, everyone. My name's Steen, head of marketing at Team, and today I'm here with Tom, the co-founder and the head of revenue as well, chief revenue officer. Today, we're going to be talking about something that is often overlooked when people are looking at international employment, global employment, and how it goes on. Everyone knows what to do when they first start, if they're hiring a contractor or using an EOR, but no one talks about the full journey. What happens when you want to move from a contractor to an employee? What happens when you want to move off an EOR into managing your own legal entity or getting someone else to manage your entity for you? This is what today's discussion about. It's all about understanding the full journey that you have with global employment. And that's kind of what Tom's going to be sort of painting the picture for us today on. Just kind of launch straight into it, Tom, on this one. What is the graduation model, and why should anyone care about it?
So I think it's all about context, right? So EOR ballooned post-COVID, and one of the things that people were looking for was an emergency solution. And we still get it today. Like we call them kind of hair on fire moments where a client rings up, or they don't ring up anymore. That'd be nice, showing my age. But when they message through the online portal and get a meeting, and they say, I've hired somebody in Portugal and I don't know how to pay them. Right? We still got that. But that whole period, that post-COVID period, was kind of that, but 1,000x. And what happened is a lot of people were ported onto an employer of record, and for a bunch of people, that's completely the right thing. But for some, employer of record should be temporary, and it should be a linear model, not singular products. So, there are the three stages. So you've got contractor, EOR, and entity. Largely, there are a couple other variations, but those are your three core states. And often what we want to make sure that people do is they're in the right state at the right time. And there's a fundamental kind of disconnect as to why that doesn't happen. And it's based on revenue, it's based on money, it's based on the purest form of capitalism, which is that it's not in an employer of record's interest to really move you around on that model, except maybe from a contractor to EOR because the fees go up. But EOR to your own entity, they call it the graduation model because essentially you're cannibalizing your income if you are unable to provide solutions downstream of that. So it's kind of like a dirty little hidden secret. Tons of people will be on EOR when they should be managing their own entity. The reason why they do that is because it's complex. There'll be like one HR person in the UK, and they'll have employees in Germany and Portugal and maybe the US or whatever it might be. But you can still wrap around the HR element, and that's what we do. So for us, the graduation model is you go through those stages at the right time, the right solution for the right time, should I say. And then when you get to own entity, we don't expect you to manage that yourself. We will build it if you need it built. And then we will wrap the HR solution that you have with the EOR element, the compliance blanket, if you like, to ensure that you're well supported and that you'll continue to grow, but you're not spending hundreds of thousands on fees that you don't need to be.
One of the other sort of providers, you'll sometimes see a EOR to crossover calculator thing. I think Deal has got one on their website and things like that. Do you know what are they there to sort of show that, or are they coming at it from a different angle?
Nah, it's all bollocks. Right? They've got no interest. It's like I imagine like if you were to look at the marketing spend for Deal, Remote, Oyster, name a few, and you looked at what proportion was spent on entity management, it is minuscule. Because it exists doesn't mean that they want to do it, doesn't mean that they encourage it, and actually doesn't mean that they've got the skill set to offer it either.
And when should a business, if they've got multiple employees all over the world, as you kind of sort of outline, when should they start considering it? When is the trigger moment for thinking about your EOR?
Yeah, so I think that you need to speak with advisors for this trigger moment. It's not like a one size, and that's one of the reasons why the gravy train has gone on for so long. Is there's not a single moment that there is a bona fide crossover moment for everybody. There is a moment where you get into a zone, okay? And the zone is precipitant on each individual country. So if you're in the UK, that zone's going to be lower than if you're in Germany and you don't speak German, or South Korea and you don't speak South Korean. Equally, that zone is based on complexity. So there are a number of different elements to it. Familiarity within your own business of the operating structure. This is at least traditionally. And then the cost of kind of compliance of getting it wrong. So, Brazil is an incredibly complex market. I think we'll talk about Brazil probably later. The crossover point there is going to be very different to the crossover point with, Netherlands or the UK or the US for that matter. But once you get into this zone, you should be having that discussion with your provider about what can they do to help you navigate that next part of the journey.
You kind of mentioned a couple of countries there. Let's sort of go into the biggest one at the moment, so the biggest in the economy. What does the graduation pathway look like in the States? So obviously you've got multiple different states, you've got different legislation. Does that make it different, or is it the same roadmap?
I'm smiling. We just completed with a client setting up in the US, and it was a client that I was directly involved in. So I ran through all the different parts of the process, which in my role I wouldn't normally do, but in this case I did. You think like the States is, the land of the home, the home of the brave and the free, and that it would be slightly loose, but there is a level of, there is an element of bureaucracy that threads itself through their system that is incredibly complex, and is designed exclusively for a national, not a foreigner. It was so complicated. I remember spending one night vibe coding a payroll solution because the payroll provider that I spoke to, that we don't use, just made me feel dumb. And I was like, hang on, it's not that complicated, and it can't be that expensive. But it's an environment that is very different to the perception. I think it's an environment that is easy to set up if you know how, but feel like it's kind of an Indiana Jones moment. There are lots and lots of booby traps.
And I guess, with the clients that we've seen to come over to the States, what's one mistake or one thing that people aren't aware of that is the thing to look out when you're setting up an entity in the States or you're looking to expand into the States?
Yeah. Trying to think. I can't remember what the Declaration of Independence is like 1667. I mean, I'm probably got that completely wrong.
A lot of angry Americans now.
Yeah, a lot of angry Americans. It's kind of late 18th century, I think, when they settle the right of who can leave the States or not. So we're talking about a country that, in many ways, in the purest sense, isn't a country as most other nations would understand it, right? So it's 50 states. Those 50 states have very different processes. There is a kind of a federal level, which is relatively easy to understand, but each individual state has its own setup for how you have to onboard and manage employees. The other thing that's kind of interesting, about the States is that if you want to set up a company as a US citizen, you can do so in, I don't know, an hour. I mean, it's really simple. You can set it up. You can get an EIN number. You can't set up a company. That's misspeaking, but you can get an EIN number, which is kind of what everyone needs to register their business. If you want to do it as a foreign national, get this. You have to do it by fax, post, or phone, right? Which is completely mad in 2026 that is the setup, and it takes weeks, right? So it goes back to that kind of Indiana Jones kind of idea, really, is that it is just, there are little booby traps, right? There are little ways of getting it quite wrong quite quickly with the States. if you know the path and you can dance between the steps, it's actually pretty straightforward. But you need to know that path. You need to have the battle scars of, knowing, how do I transfer my employees' healthcare using Cobra? What is the process? How do I, recompense them once they've done that? Another thing that you have to do by post, by the way. So, there are a lot of different elements to the US that I think aren't clear. I think most informatively, it's not a single unified country with policies that stem across one side of the ocean to the other. It is 50 independent states with kind of an overriding kind of philosophy. And that difference and that nuance is quite important. One of the things you do see, and actually one of the pitfalls, is that people forget that because often they're told to set up in Delaware, which very good place to set up. We advise our clients often to be in Delaware, not always. It's not always the right place. But then if you want to onboard an employee, you have to set them up in a different state. And all of a sudden, there is a different process. And you have to pay different people. And you need a state registry. And there is an element of complexity that perhaps isn't immediately obvious. It's bureaucratic, I think is probably the best way of putting it.
Excellent. Yeah, no, everyone getting a slice of the pie, making sure that all the middle people get paid along the way.
The states, they love a middleman. They love a middleman. And in every process, there is someone, setting up your 401k, setting up your benefits. Yeah, there'll be introducers. It is, everyone's there to help. Like it's like once you get on the train, like it flows, it moves, but it's not the easiest self-serve, economy.
And not trying to be too lead in this. What would be the top tip? Or what's the key thing that someone would want to take away from that section about expanding to the States?
It's difficult to put a singular thing, but one of the things is think about where you're going to have your employees, right? As I said, 50 independent states, 50 independent ways of working. In a bunch of states, there are no such thing as a non-compete clause. If you've got IP, that might be something that's pretty important to you. If you want to terminate employees in California, that's a very different process to Texas. So I think the one thing about it is to be intentional about where you place your boots on the ground. There are a ton of other elements that you need to be thoughtful of, but I think that if I was going to give one immediate piece of advice is be intentional about where you put your boots on the ground, and also think about, it is easier to have a nebulous, we've got clients that have, might only have 7 employees, but they're in 7 different states. There are elements to setting up benefits schemes that become quite difficult because they are typically offered from a single state to those employees in a single state, and then branched out. So if you don't have a nucleus, it can be slightly difficult, or not difficult. You just have to find different workarounds. But primarily, I'd say, think about where you're going to put your people and be intentional, and don't follow the crowd. It's setting up in New York costs a lot more than setting up in other states. The talent is more expensive. Talent in the US is distributed pretty evenly, so there are a ton of opportunities. Slightly off the beaten track, I'd say.
Okay, brilliant. Staying to the Americas side of things, you mentioned Brazil earlier.
Brazil.
And we found this, within our, sales call and client calls and things like that. It's becoming a country of interest to a lot of people at the moment. Why is that? Why is that problematic to certain people?
So I went to Brazil with my wife, and we had the most amazing time hanging out on Copacabana Beach, going to great restaurants, eating great food. You look at the carnival, you look at the way that they live their lives. It promotes this kind of idea of fun, right? Is a country that appears and looks to a tourist as fun. And actually, it is. Like, as a tourist, it's brilliant. We had the most amazing time there, and can't wait to go back. As an employer, holy crap. It is, I was saying that the US is bureaucratic. I mean, in hindsight, the US is not bureaucratic. It is at one end of, maybe not one end of the scale, but it's certainly the other end of the scale to Brazil. We recently advised a client. They've got 10 people in there in Brazil. A lot of people set up on contractors in Brazil because they have the wrong perception of the environment. And then when you tell them the way to become compliant, like, I think they go to ChatGPT because they must think you're lying. I advised one client recently that it's not just the time. So, it's not that there are 3 levels to set up an entity in that environment. It is that, and being local, state, and national, it is that the amount of executive time required to open an office in that environment, which is usually unaccounted for. So if you did your fully loaded costs, is big, really big. So, I was advising a customer that I was predicting that to set up their entity, including their costs, was somewhere between $250,000 and $350,000. Wow. So serious amounts of money. And now they've got a problem, right? So they've got 10 contractors, which they should or they shouldn't have, depending on interpretations. They need to get those people compliant. How are they going to do it? The fastest route is EOR. Now, EOR is not a magic bullet in Brazil. It comes with some risks. You retain some of the PE risks. There are elements that certainly help. Like, it is the often the best of a bad bunch of options, but it's not cheap, right? I reckon that most companies subsidize their global pricing to Brazil, because to operate in Brazil is an extraordinarily complex environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the challenges that certain markets throw up, and Brazil is a good example of what could look like a very attractive sector and economy. A lot of opportunity. However, people either think to go in there with a contractors or entity, and some of the challenges that get thrown up within that sort of space. I mean, just to kind of throw in there, we've got to talk about our own lead magnets. If you have got concerns around your contractors and things like that, we do have a tool that helps you understand that classification risk that you can look into as well. So kind of to see whether it's something that you need to talk to someone about, or if you're on safe ground on those things. So what would you say? I think you had this situation, but if a CEO has just been told that Brazil or maybe can expand it, countries in South America, Brazil, Paraguay, that sort of thing, is the next big opportunity and wants to move fast?
So yeah, we have set up an organization in South America recently. I would say that a lot of it depends on what you're selling to whom and where. Okay, so if you want to sell into Brazil and you want to sell, software services, whatever it might be, and you do need to get your own individual tax advice on this, it is specific to Nuance, there is a sales tax of roughly 36%, okay? Which means that if you are selling outside in, your margin is kind of gobbled up by this tax, which then promotes you to kind of set up your entity in the market. Do not set up your entity until you are absolutely confident that this is a long-term market for you to enter. Accept the risk of the sales tax whilst you build up a level of localized product market fit. And at that point of inflection, and that'll be different for every business, but it could be a few million, could be a lot more, then you make your choice to kind of enter that market completely and fully because of the establishment costs I mentioned. In the meantime, there are South American areas that are are better to set up. You've got to remember that South America has a long political history of very strong workers' rights movements. Chile is another example. That have socialist governments in the 70s when policy was often being written, and that policy is often very, very, very worker friendly, which is, power to them. Good for nationals in certain environments, not necessarily good for growth, but power to them. What it does mean, though, is if you're setting up as an outsider, just be very mindful of, what's your exit provision? If you're going into, seeing you were a Marine back in the day. If you go into a room, I've watched a few Jack Reacher movies. You're meant to be checking out for the exits, right? As you go in. I think in business it's an odd analogy, but I'll stick with it.
I like it. It's a good
because you need to be checking for the exits, on arrival. That's because bad things happen more than we like to predict. We have a bias towards thinking that everything is going to be sunshine and rainbows. Especially in expansion, because expansion is driven by the view that things are going to be generating. We're going to do this to deliver more money, more revenue, more resource, whatever it might be. And, just be really wary of the exits. Countries where I think, that's better, we've set up some businesses in free trade zones in Uruguay. I think that's a very strong market. I think that the setup there is robust. Okay, you can set up in Uruguay, have your employees selling into Brazil under certain considerations. Please seek advice. Where you then kind of can get that product market fit. You can work out whether or not it is Brazil you want to be selling to. Alternatively, you might not want to sell into Brazil at all, but you just want talent, and you want talent in that jurisdiction, geographical market. Uruguay, a great place for that, in my opinion. Second, I think on that list, probably follow up would be Paraguay. A strong contender, a real emerger that we're seeing in the region right now. I'd say that the drawback on Paraguay is still that from a banking perspective, it's a little bit looser. It can take a long time to set up a bank account, mind you, but from a international compliance and banking and regulatory standpoint, it's a little bit looser. And I think that it doesn't scream compliance. And if that's an investor requirement for your business, or you have something that requires you to disclose levels of information, future acquirers of business may have kind of questions marks more around Paraguay than they would around Uruguay. Still a solid market to be looking at. We'll see what happens with Argentina. Obviously the worker reforms there have been good news for people entering that market. And if that continues on that vein, then that too, I think, is an interesting avenue to look at.
I might thank you for that. I might be putting you a bit on the spot on this one, so apologies if I am. But you mentioned PE a couple of times. Just for members who are watching this video who might not know what permanent establishment is or permanent establishment risk is, are you able to kind of just articulate that?
Yeah, it's a fixed place of business where a company conducts its activities via, I think, what's called a dependent agent. Okay, so it means you've got someone there that is conducting business on your behalf. That definition obviously varies state to state, country to country. There are treaties versus local laws. But by and large, if you are operating in a country and you have a person there that is, in Brazil, the bar is much lower. In other countries, it will be, let's say they're signing commercial contracts, they're statistically important to the business, they are generating business in that area. There are a ton of different kind of milestones and markers. But essentially what it has is it has a taxable impact. So foreign companies where there is the establishment or a proven permanent establishment are subject to corporate income tax, typically on profitable attributment from that establishment. So, for example, you sign a bunch of contracts for $1 million that is conducted in the US, but the salesperson has signed it in Brazil, for example, then theoretically there is the Brazilian state has a view that that £1 million was generated in the local market, and therefore there is a taxable event that occurs to that revenue, which is obviously what people are very keen to avoid, because the reality is that's not really how it feels in a business or how it happens. But tax law wasn't written for remote work. Okay, so and we can't change that overnight. We have to be just mindful of how it works and operate around it, which is why in a lot of these markets, not to sell our own services, but employer of record diminishes a lot of that risk. Not always, and I said case by case, but in many cases you can diminish some of that risk with employer of record.
Thanks for going with that. That's something that we get asked or looked up a lot, is around the PE risks and what it means. So kind of good to get that.
Yeah,
overview.
It's just when you've got like a ton of contracts and you think, well, that's kind of inconsequential. And it's not. I think that the other thing is it's about risk. All of these things are about risk. Risk appetite determines what course of action you should take. And that's up to each individual business to operate within or understand. The one thing I would encourage is it's fine to say that it's about risk management. I think that what's important to note is for our HR colleagues, it's important for them to make their leadership and board aware of what the actual risks are, right? So, the implied risk might be smaller in, let's say, the world net is closing. There are less and less countries where the risk is limited. But I'll just pick an example. It might be lower in Uruguay than it is in Brazil. And in Brazil, it might be actually very significant. It might be so meaningfully significant that the board needs to discuss how they're going to treat that risk. And that's fine if people then decide that they're going to take that risk. But I think it's the knowing, the head in the sand attitude isn't appropriate for countries where the risk is much greater than you realize.
Yes, yeah. And the fines and the impact can be quite high as well from these.
I mean, we've seen monster fines, and companies don't disclose them because it's not something you want to talk about. You don't say, hey, by the way, so these things are often kind of kept quite quiet, but we've seen some very, very sizable events sometimes in countries you wouldn't expect.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. To kind of just move it back onto the kind of the graduation element and bring it, I guess, we're obviously a global, but we have a very strong presence in Europe, being based in the UK and being that kind of the bridge for reaching out to different parts of the world. How does Europe and the graduation model kind of impact? Does it work easier in Europe to go from EOR to entity, or is there more challenges with the regulations coming in?
Yes and no. I mean, we're probably more comfortable with it because we're European, right? We've got people all over Europe. We're dotted in 8 or 9 other countries. We have our own entities and have had for a very long time in all of these markets. We've been through the mill, so we know we've got the scar tissue of knowing exactly. So for us, it feels easy. I still think that if you're an American looking at the market, you would have a different perspective. So important to say. Is it easier? I think that the crossover point is often easier to articulate. The one thing I'd say is that language is a big language is one of those elements that probably doesn't make it onto the spreadsheet first, but probably should. So if you are trying to operate in Germany, the technical crossover point that Claude or Chat GPT might give you is probably relatively early. But do you have the operating capability to manage the German notices that are provided sometimes in the post? Do you have that set up? You need, and this is where I think we've kind of nailed it, is by providing the wrapper, is saying, look, set up your own entity because it's a thing that you should be doing at your stage. But you need to retain some element of compliance. You need to still run your own businesses. You need to not wake up in the middle of the night worrying about, what a individual in the Netherlands is going to do if they're on sick leave and you want to let them go. You don't want to have to call up a Magic Circle law firm to be able to provide you with advice because you don't know where to go. There is this kind of advisory wrapper that I think is probably critical in Europe because of the language element that I think most companies should adopt, even if you want to do it on your own later on. We've got companies that eventually have hired their own HR people in Portugal or whatever it might be. But it is smoothing out those transitions that is the critical element of our business, advising you when to be in EOR, advising you when to do your own entity, but sort of helping you through that process. I've got a great example. We have a client where they set up in the Netherlands, and they had a problem setting up their bank. If anything, by the way, is a delayer on setting up your entity, it is the bank. The misconception that you can use a neobank, a Revolut, a Monzo, etc. Sometimes you can't, and some require almost egregious levels of due diligence, which may come as a surprise to some people. Anyway, this particular case, the client didn't set up the bank in time. They said they could, they said they would, and they were starting to panic. So I spoke to the COO and I said, they've been a client for a long time. I said, look, if it gets to the 12th hour and you haven't set up the bank and you can't pay your employees, we'll pay your employees. Send the money to us. In fact, we actually did it without them. We took it on trust. They've been a great client for a very long time. I think they paid their invoice, maybe 12 hours later. But the point was that having a partner that will smooth out the dents and the bumps in the road is the bit that is critical.
Yeah, have that flexibility. I think, which I was actually speaking to Chief People Officer at the here today, was for a major travel brand. I can't say who it was, but a big company, a couple of 2,000 to 3,000 employees, and they're having the same problems. 10 people in different countries, and they haven't had a HR leader. Got caught out about the Netherlands' new travel to work incentive scheme, however you want to call it. That if you walk, you get paid one amount. If you cycle, you get paid another amount. If you take the bus, you get paid another amount. But everyone gets some money to basically get to work. I think it's a collective agreement, not a country agreement. But they still need to know and understand and put all those sort of things into force.
And there's you saying that it's an easier market. I think it's easy to set up, because it's structured, okay, and it's structured so that it's, the steps are reasonably. You could write them down on a piece of paper, like the Brazil setup. It's like, it's like a mind map. Right, the thought process looks like a mind map, whereas in Europe the process is a flow chart. Okay, so you get 1, 2, 3. The intricacy is that the EU is directive heavy. Okay, and those directives come thick and fast. So there are things that they will do, that they will signpost 2-3 years, and then in third year, whatever it might be, whatever the lead time is, they come into force. And a lot of people make a noise at the beginning, and then when it comes to the implementation, forget about it and then get caught out. So I think that's a classic point that you make. The same as the EU Platform Work Directive. Yeah, this is what I was talking about, the net closing on contractors. Governments around the world are stagnating. They're not seeing huge levels of growth. They are finding more and more ingenious ways of taxing personal individuals and companies. And this is a classic example, because everybody is established to be an employee unless proven otherwise. If you don't do that and you don't do the work and you don't have an advisory layer telling you how to do that, and what the difference is, because they're at national levels, so it's not at an EU level, similar to the US in terms of 50 states, is you get caught out really fast. And that's what stops people doing their own entities. And EOR is the right thing for most people most of the time, right? But when you get to a certain point, you should be on a different model, but the knowledge gap stops you, right? And all these other EOR companies, they hold and hoard that knowledge. Maybe LLMs will create a little bit less asymmetry, but they hoard and hold that knowledge because they want to keep you on the most expensive product for the longest period of time. And our perspective is that there's a right time and a wrong time to be in each one of them.
I'm just conscious of time, so I just kind of want to bring it to a close. What's the one thing you want someone to take away from this conversation about the graduation model? I guess the complications around contractors, what's the next steps for someone to sort of take as well?
Yeah, we run a different model here. So like most company and providers in our area, we're much more client-centric. We're much more focused on long-term relationships. We're much older school in that context, I think. And my one takeaway would be that if you're not a client or you are a client, ask the questions to get advice from us. Don't trust the other people. I mean, and I don't mean that flippantly. Calling your CSM that's done the job for 6 months, or your account manager or your sales contact, if the organization isn't set up to be able to provide the workflow through the different stages of the organization flow, they won't be able to do it. They won't be able to give you good advice. So I would get advice from team to see whether or not I'm in the right thing at the right time, and plan it. The second one I'd say, rather than being slightly self-serving, although I do believe it, is never ever decide to have an entity ASAP. Like it is, if there is one thing, I mean, we have actually not taken on work because the client was too insistent on the timelines. Things are, in some cases, formulaic, but that doesn't make them smooth. And you get these kind of cluster bombs of challenges. It could be, the notary signed a particular piece of documentation and you send it to the wrong place. We've seen a similar case to that very, very recently. Simple things aren't always simple if there's a lot of them, right? So don't do it as fast as you can. Plan it. Say we're going to do it 6 months' time. Always run models concurrently. So run your EOR model whilst you're setting up your entity. There is absolutely nobody wins. There is no financial gain, no matter what the spreadsheet says, from trying to do it so quickly that you end up causing problems and challenges in your own operating company, not in us, in your own. So it's going to ruin, if you're a COO, it's going to ruin your life trying to get this done overnight, because things just don't move that quickly sometimes, and you'll just be pushing against an immovable object. So that'd be my one piece of advice would be, get advice from somebody at Team, because we do it all the time. My second would be that don't do it. You can do it quickly, just don't do it ASAP. Don't do it in too much of a hurry.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks for your time today. I think kind of to wrap it all up, the as often the conversations in this space are, the world is complicated, and it's getting more complicated as more regulations come on board, geopolitical risk in this world and that. So having an expert partner on your side to help advise you and give you the guidance that you need and decide what type of entity or you should be contract or EOR becomes more and more important as you go through it. And as Tom has mentioned, you can kind of come to Teamed and we will do what we call a strategy session with you, where we just tell you, we look at your model and we sort of say, this is the things that we advise. There's no, you don't have to, sign up with us or anything like that. It's a free consultation. So definitely worth having a look at. And if you don't want to have a call, we also have some models that kind of help give some guidance to when the crossover point discussion should be happening as well. We'll link all that stuff in the YouTube video underneath as well. But once again, thanks everyone. Thanks Tom for your time today.
Perfect. Did you just knock something over?
No, very closely. My water bottle, it wobbled.
Perfect. Yeah. So look, thanks everyone. Thanks for your time. As Dean says, we're always here to have a conversation, and we'll give you the honest answers. Not always the ones you want, but the ones that sometimes you'll need.